This is the pith and point, the sum and substance of the whole labor problem and of the whole honesty problem. It is this, and this alone, that can assure every man the entire product of his own labor. Free access to land would place every man in a position to be his own judge of what is the just recompense for his services, in whatever capacity put forth, and no other man could command those services without rendering that full equivalent. The selling of labor would then become a business transaction on the same plane as other merchandising, and as in other buying and selling, there would be no trade without the mutual agreement of the two sides of the bargain. The effect of free trade or cheap land upon wages is no matter of theory. It has been put to the proof in many parts of the world. It is the competitive bidding of cheap land against other lines of industry that makes wages proverbially high in a new country. It is simply the old story over again, the argument that political orators have made trite these many years in a far different cause, of the beneficent results to the working man of two jobs looking for one man as against two men looking for one job. And the magic spell of the land would work just as well when times were hard as when times were good. When not another job was looking for the man, the land would still be there, ever calling him to the opportunity of honest labor and a competence. Even when times were good, many men would prefer the land with its simpler life of health, and would secure for themselves a home upon it. But when times were hard, there would be an exodus from the cities to the country and its certainty of employment. With land reform would come a relief from the pressure of land in the cities, so that the urban population would soon become scattered over a much larger area, and the cities themselves would take on more of the characteristics of the country. It would then be possible for every man in the city, no matter what his occupation, to have a home for himself and his loved ones within an easy distance of his work, with land enough to furnish all the advantages of country life, land which, if other employment failed him, he could turn into a little farm that, under careful cultivation, would yield an ample living. For it is one of the facts that we need most to remember, that a few good acres wisely tilled will give an abundant support to an average family. Reward of capital, and in furnishing the basis for determining the just compensation of labor, land reform would likewise furnish a basis for determining the just compensation of capital. The entire joint product of labor and capital is divided of necessity among three beneficiaries. A part goes in rent to the landlord, who under present conditions may be also the capitalist or the laborer concerned, or both. This portion is fixed by the economic law of rent, and is beyond human control except in so far as it is possible to stop the holding of land out of use, and so give the law of rent free course to work itself out in a natural and untrammeled manner. The rest of the joint product goes to capital and labor, to labor in the form of wages and salaries, and to capital in the form of interest and dividends. The fixing of the just compensation of labor is merely the finding of the righteous balancing point between the demands of capital and the demands of labor. The two together absorb all there is left after rent is satisfied. What does not go to one, perforce goes to the other, so that when we have determined the share that should go in justice to labor, we have also performed the same service for capital. And as the just compensation of labor is all it will bring in the free market assured by land reform, so the just compensation of capital is all it will bring under the same conditions. This means, of course, under the canons of honesty, that capital is a producer and is to be rewarded as such. In other words, capital and labor together produce more than labor alone can produce, and the owner of the capital is honestly entitled to capital's share of the joint product, and that share under land reform would be what labor would be willing to pay for the use of the capital in production rather than produce without the capital. For in the last analysis, it would always be labor that would employ capital, and not capital that would employ labor. The ratio of the division of the joint product rent deducted between capital and labor, would then depend in large degree upon the quantity of capital existing and seeking employment, and the ease with which new capital could be created. Thus, it would be labor that would become the dominant factor of the industrial situation, and capital would sink to a subordinate, though none the less important, position. The one essential. No man of intelligence and heart can look around over the civilized world today without realizing that there is something woefully wrong in the organization of things. Why is it, he must ask himself again and again, why is it that in this age of marvelous material progress, the palaces of the rich, often the idle rich, have their unfailing counterpart in the crowded tenements of the poor, the working poor? Why do the beauty and elegance of the boulevard and the suburb require an inevitable complement of squalor and misery in the slums? Why is it that in the midst of the greatest national prosperity that ever came to any people in the history of the world, times have always been hard in the homes of the working masses, and at the first shock of financial depression, half the population of our large cities is reduced to half rations, and thousands of honest men willing and eager to work are driven to the bread line and the soup kitchen? Why this ever-increasing congestion of population in the great centers? Why these cramped cottages crowded together on 25-foot lots with a bare passageway between them? Why this piling up of humanity in 5-room flats, tier on tier, with only half enough of light and air for human needs? Why these densely populated districts where men, women, and children are packed together under conditions prolific of physical, moral, and social delinquency? Why these vast city areas where the prevailing conditions in good and bad times alike are destitution and disease and despair? And again, why this perpetual warfare between capital and labor? The working man has something to sell that the capitalist wishes to buy. They are merely the two parties to a bargain that does not differ on the surface from other bargains. Why can they not come to the terms without this constant clashing of interest against interest? There is no such continual conflict between other buyers and sellers. The farmer does not go round forever with a club up his sleeve for the man to whom he sells his crops. The merchant and his customers do not depend upon an armed truce as a condition preliminary to doing business. The manufacturer is marketing his goods to the jobber, and the jobber, in his dealings with the retailer, never find it necessary to resort to force in order to get the price that they believe to be their due. Why this difference between the buying and selling of labor and the buying and selling of other things? We have seen that there is one answer to both of these groups of questions. The working man is not a different species from other humanity. He is not more quarrelsome by nature. He is not more unreasonable or more violent or more clamorous for his rights. The fact is that the working man is cornered by the present social system so that he must resist or be crushed, and the farmer, the merchant, and the manufacturer would use the same tactics under like conditions. It is true that all classes of producers are in greater or less degree the victims of the land monopoly system, whose only beneficiary is the landowner, but the wage worker is the greatest sufferer. The farmer, the merchant, and the manufacturer, with their accumulations of capital, great or small, and often with the accompanying advantage of land ownership itself, are not under the immediate necessity to sell their product that the working man is under to sell his labor. They can wait, if need be, without discomfort for a week or a month or a year, while the wage worker must have employment today if he and his family are to eat tomorrow. And all these others do business, or at least did up to the time of the land monopoly fostered trusts, under conditions that assure right prices by the process of free competition. But the working man is barred by land monopoly from this natural adjustment of prices, shut off from access to his natural employer, the land, and denied the inherent right of self-sustenance. He is forced to sell his labor under conditions unnatural and unjust. He is practically at the mercy of the employing class, which is protected by land monopoly on its side of the bargain from the natural competition of the earth. The laborer stands at bay to the capitalists. He cannot escape. He must yield to their terms of employment or starve or fight. And sometimes, man that he is, he fights. We have seen that this is the part of the labor union in the problem. And through this warfare, which happily seldom reaches the stage of violence and blood, the laborer is able in a degree and for a few of his kind to counteract the land monopoly influence in the fixing of labor prices and labor conditions. But the labor union is only a weapon of defense in a siege which it does not attempt to repel or to raise. Labor unionism accepts social conditions as they are with all their unfairness to labor and seeks to offset that fairness by artificial measures bearing no natural relation to the conditions to be remedied. Land reform, on the other hand, strikes at the root of the wrong and seeks to blot it out of existence. Labor unionism is a palliative at best. Land reform is a radical cure.